So there I was, sipping coffee by the lake, when I saw a line of SUVs roll up like they were coming to serve justice. Except it wasn't the police, it was the HOA. They marched onto my property like they owned the place, barking orders, snapping pictures, saying things like, "This deck isn't approved," and "You'll need to vacate." They had no idea whose land they just stepped onto, because this lake house has been in my family longer than their HOA even existed. And me? I don't fold easy. They thought they could push me around with fake authority, but what happened next made them regret ever crossing that property line. The moment their SUVs halted and the officials began relaying their unwelcome edicts over bullhorns, something inside me snapped. I set down my coffee, the warm mug forgotten as my pulse quickened. In that instant I knew. This wasn't just another day in Crescent Lake Estates. It was the day I decided to stand up, loud and clear, against the tyranny of unwanted rules. Crescent Lake Estates had always been the picture of suburban order. Nestled along a gently winding lake, the community boasted neatly trimmed lawns, identical houses in muted tones, and a sprawling network of paved streets where every resident knew the unspoken rule: conformity was king. The local homeowners association, led by a board of stern-faced officials and, in particular, by the infamous HOA Karen and her loyal enforcers, maintained an iron grip on every aspect of community life. They dictated everything from the color of your window boxes to the permissible styles of outdoor decor. I, however, was not like the others. I'd inherited my family's lake house, a charming, weathered property with a storied past that stretched back generations. Unlike the cookie-cutter homes of Crescent Lake Estates, my lake house held memories of summer vacations, late-night bonfires, and quiet moments by the water's edge. It was my sanctuary, a place where nature's beauty and my family's legacy intertwined. Every brick and beam of the old house echoed with stories that no HOA regulation could ever erase. I've always prided myself on preserving the history of my home while embracing a bit of rebellion against the stale monotony imposed by the HOA. I decorated my property with personal touches, a hand-painted mural by local artists, an overgrown but lovingly tended wildflower garden, and even a weathered old deck extended by modest, yet artful, addition. To me, these expressions of individuality were what truly made a home. They were a testament to the freedom of creative expression that our community should value, not suppress. Then there's the HOA. Its officers, the enforcers of a rigid set of rules, saw any deviation as a threat to the community's pristine image. Karen and her team had a near-obsessive fixation on uniformity. If something didn't match her idea of perfection, even if it held sentimental value or historic charm, it was to be eradicated. Their approach was bureaucratic and cold, a system designed to quash personal expression in favor of an oppressive sameness. On that fateful morning, I had barely finished my quiet coffee when the invasion began. The SUVs rolled up in a disciplined line, and the officers, wearing identical uniforms emblazoned with the HOA insignia, began to swarm my property. I remembered how, as a child, I'd run barefoot through the fields surrounding my lake house, free and unburdened by rules. I'd never imagined that one day, the very same freedom would be challenged by those who prided themselves on control. My home is not just a building. It is a living part of my family's legacy, steeped in stories and memories of generations past. And no one, not even an overzealous HOA, had the right to trample upon that legacy with baseless orders and oppressive fines. The invasion was swift and shocking. I watched from behind my lace-curtained window as the HOA officers, stern, unsmiling, and armed with clipboards, advanced across the manicured lawn. They zeroed in on every infraction they could possibly document: a slightly unleveled deck, an overgrown shrub, and even the placement of a weathered canoe by the lake. Every detail was scrutinized, all in the name of preserving a uniform aesthetic that never quite fit the history or spirit of my property. I had always known the HOA's methods were draconian, but to see them impose their will in full force on my family's lake house was a blow I couldn't ignore. The officers barked orders that I had no legal obligation to obey, claiming that the property had violated community standards. They insisted that I vacate the premises immediately for an inspection, demanding that I correct every perceived imperfection before they would allow me to remain. Fury welled up inside me. I had spent years safeguarding my property and investing my heart into maintaining its character. Now, Karen and her enforcers treated it as if it were a showpiece to be locked down and sterilized. My mind raced through all the nights I'd spent restoring old photographs and listening to my grandfather's stories of how our lake house had weathered storms and wars, standing proud through it all. The very idea that these memories could be dismissed as mere nonconformity was intolerable. I decided that I was not going to back down. I had a choice: bow to their petty authority or stand my ground and defend my heritage. I chose the latter. While they prattled on about regulations and fines, I slipped outside, determined to confront the intrusion. As I approached the front yard, a mix of defiance and resolve pulsated through me. I could already hear the murmurs of the gathered residents, some supporting me, others too fearful to speak out. I knew that in this battle, evidence was my strongest ally. I had meticulously set up security cameras around the property, and now I recorded every action, the harsh words of the officers, the dismissive tone of their demands, and finally, the moment when one of them approached my front door with an ultimatum. I resolved then and there that I would document every moment to ensure that the truth, the history, and the right to live freely on my property would ultimately prevail. By the time the first attempts to forcibly clear my property began, I had already contacted a local attorney who specialized in property rights. I knew that the HOA had no legal basis to commandeer my private land. I was prepared to contest every fine, every order, every baseless regulation. My attorney assured me that my family's deed, steeped in generations of history, was well protected by law, and that any attempt by the HOA to strip away our rights would be met with vigorous defense. The tension grew palpable as the officers began their inspection, scanning every inch of my property. My heart pounded as I watched them circle the back deck, their clipboards clicking as they made notes. Every tick of the clock brought me closer to the moment when I would have to confront them, when I would stand unyielding before the authorities who had no right to invade my sanctuary. Neighbors gathered at a discreet distance, whispering in support and watching as the confrontation escalated. My security footage began streaming online, and soon the digital wave of support was undeniable. Comments like "stand your ground" and "our property is our heritage" flashed across the screen, bolstering my resolve. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't merely a personal battle. It was a stand for every resident who had ever felt oppressed by arbitrary rules. And so, as the officers finished their inspection and prepared to issue a series of fines, I took my place on the porch. I looked them in the eye and calmly stated, "I understand your concern, but my property is legally mine, my family's legacy preserved for generations. I will not be bullied by arbitrary rules." My words, measured yet defiant, resonated in the quiet that followed. It was a direct challenge, a refusal to allow anyone, not even the HOA, to dictate how I should live. I could see uncertainty in the officers' eyes. Their rigid expressions wavered momentarily as my resolve shone through. I knew then that this confrontation would set the tone for what was to come. My digital dossier was growing, and the community was rallying behind me. The seeds of resistance had been sown, and soon the entire narrative would shift in favor of individual rights over bureaucratic overreach. In the hours following my stand, the drama of the invasion quickly seeped into every corner of Cedar Ridge. Social media was set ablaze with live streams, photos, and impassioned status updates from residents who either witnessed the confrontation or had heard about it from multiple sources. Hashtags like #MyLandRules and #CedarRidgeStandsUp began trending locally, as neighbors flooded the online forums with their support and a growing chorus of demands for accountability. Local news stations picked up the story with relentless enthusiasm. Reporters arrived on the scene and captured footage of the disputed area from every possible angle. It appears that what started as a routine enforcement of community rules has spiraled into a significant clash of wills. One news anchor remarked on live television. Interviews with neighbors revealed that many had long been frustrated by the HOA's heavy-handed enforcement and the oppressive control exerted by officers like those who invaded my property that morning. The narrative rapidly transformed from a minor infraction into a potent symbol of community resistance against a system that favored conformity over individuality. Inside the HOA board, internal tensions began to boil over. In a series of emergency meetings convened behind closed doors, board members argued vehemently over how to handle the unfolding crisis. Some, deeply entrenched in the belief that strict enforcement was necessary to maintain property values and aesthetic uniformity, insisted that the officers were simply doing their jobs. Others, however, began to question whether Karen's infamous tactics and the recent invasion of my private property had gone too far. Heated exchanges ensued, and leaked minutes from these sessions painted a picture of a board divided, its cohesion unraveling under the pressure of public scrutiny. My digital dossier of the incident, meticulously compiled from security footage, time-stamped photos, and voice recordings from that tense morning, became a rallying point for the outraged residents of Cedar Ridge. The evidence was irrefutable. A group of HOA officers, not law enforcement, had invaded my private land and attempted to impose fines for conditions that were entirely within my rights as a homeowner. Online petitions demanding the resignation of the HOA board members responsible for the intrusion began to collect thousands of signatures overnight. Neighbors, emboldened by the thought of finally challenging the oppressive system, began sharing their own stories of harassment and arbitrary fines. The digital climate grew so intense that even local authorities were forced to respond. A statement from the regional police department clarified that while the officers on duty were acting under the instructions of the HOA, no legal authority allowed them to enforce community standards on private property without proper jurisdiction. This official clarification resonated deeply with the community, further rallying support for my case and adding pressure on the HOA board to amend its policies. In the days leading up to the final public hearing, I continued to post live updates from my property. I shared detailed breakdowns of the digital evidence, highlighting the exact moments when the officers crossed the property line, the tone of their demands, and even snippets of my conversation with them. The online community response was overwhelming. Neighbors wrote, "This is a victory for property rights and our land, our rules. No one can tell us otherwise." The hashtags and digital signatures on the petition grew exponentially, capturing the attention of local influencers and even drawing commentary from a few respected legal analysts in the area. Meanwhile, Karen's own attempts to spin the incident on social media only fueled the rebellion. In a series of hurried posts, she claimed that the invasion was part of a community safety audit and that she was merely enforcing rules to protect property values. But every claim was immediately contradicted by the visual and digital evidence circulating online. Her narrative collapsed under the weight of public opinion and the undeniable proof of her overreach. The tension reached a boiling point when the HOA board announced the final public hearing, a chance for every resident to voice their concerns and vote on whether to uphold or rescind the sanctions imposed on me that very morning. The atmosphere in Cedar Ridge was electric. Small gatherings formed in local parks as residents rehearsed their testimonies and planned peaceful protests. On the morning of the hearing, community members arrived in droves at the Cedar Ridge Community Center. The energy was palpable, with residents arriving with signs proclaiming "Our property, our rights, and no more forced conformity." My digital dossier was projected on large screens for all to see, and every piece of evidence was discussed in hushed but determined tones. The final hours before the hearing were a flurry of activity. Neighbors exchanging supportive messages, local bloggers sharing the story, and online petitions reaching record numbers. It was clear to everyone that this wasn't just a personal battle. It was a watershed moment for all of Cedar Ridge, a defining instance of the struggle between individual freedom and bureaucratic overreach. The fight for my lake house, for my right to manage my property without interference, had become emblematic of a larger movement. And as the day of the hearing finally dawned, the entire community braced itself for the turning point that would irrevocably alter the balance of power in our neighborhood. The decisive moment arrived on a crisp, clear morning at the Cedar Ridge Community Center, in a boardroom packed with HOA officials, local law enforcement, community leaders, and hundreds of determined residents. With an unwavering presence, Councilwoman Angela Rivera stepped up to the podium, her gaze steady and resolute as she prepared to deliver the final verdict on the incident that had rocked our community. After a thorough review of all digital evidence, including security footage of the morning invasion, detailed photographic documentation, and the impassioned testimonies of our residents, we have reached an irrefutable conclusion. Councilwoman Rivera began, her voice echoing with authority. It is clear that the actions taken by the HOA officers who invaded private property under the guise of enforcing community standards were a gross overreach. Our lake house, our home, has been in this family for generations, long before this HOA ever existed. No one, not even those with self-appointed power, has the right to dictate how we manage our property. A heavy silence fell over the room as Rivera continued. Effective immediately, all sanctions and fines imposed as a result of this invasion will be rescinded. Furthermore, we will launch a full disciplinary review of the practices that allowed such unauthorized enforcement on private property. We will institute new guidelines to ensure that any intervention by public or quasi-public entities is strictly within the limits of the law. Today's decision is not merely about one incident. It is a resounding declaration that in Cedar Ridge, individual property rights must be upheld above all else. Her words struck a chord among the residents. Murmurs of agreement swept through the crowd, each person silently affirming their shared commitment to defending their rights. At that moment, a well-known community advocate, renowned for his steadfast defense of personal freedoms, rose to speak. "Today, we stand as a united front against tyranny," he declared, his voice strong and impassioned. "No resident should ever have to face the arbitrary impositions of an overzealous authority. Let this be the turning point where Cedar Ridge reclaims its core values: freedom, responsibility, and respect for individual property. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until our voices are heard and our rights are recognized." His declaration was met with resounding applause that filled the room with a palpable sense of unity and purpose. Following his address, a senior officer from the local public safety department presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record that included all digital evidence, expert testimonies, and official documentation confirming the unlawful nature of the HOA officers' actions. The evidence was overwhelming. My property was legally mine, and every act of intrusion had been a gross violation of my rights. The Internal Affairs panel had unanimously supported disciplinary measures against those responsible, and the full report was set for immediate public disclosure. Councilwoman Rivera then concluded, "Let today mark the beginning of a new era for Cedar Ridge, a community where every homeowner's rights are sacred and where any form of arbitrary enforcement is met with the full force of our collective will. Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will protect our freedoms and that no individual, no matter how self-righteous, can infringe upon our right to live freely. Together, we stand for justice, accountability, and the enduring spirit of our community." Her final words, delivered with unyielding conviction, sealed the turning point in our struggle. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The unified voice of Cedar Ridge, underpinned by overwhelming digital evidence, forced the HOA board to accept a new reality, one in which individual rights and property ownership were beyond reproach. The days of petty, arbitrary rule enforcement were finally over. In the weeks following the final vote, Cedar Ridge underwent a remarkable transformation. News of the rescinded sanctions and the sweeping reforms implemented by the HOA board spread rapidly through local media and on social networks, igniting a vibrant dialogue about property rights, individual freedoms, and the need for transparent governance. Editorials in the local newspaper, boasting headlines such as "A New Dawn for Cedar Ridge" and "Community United for Justice," celebrated the decisive action taken to protect every resident's right to manage their own property without arbitrary interference. Hashtags like #PropertyRights, #NoMoreHOBullying, and #StandForFreedom trended widely, echoing the collective voice of a community that had long been denied its autonomy. Town hall meetings and community forums saw record attendance as residents gathered to share their experiences and envision a future where personal creativity and independent living were honored. Neighbors, who had once been silenced by the oppressive hand of the HOA, now spoke with fervor and pride. "Our land is our legacy," one impassioned resident proclaimed at a bustling meeting, his words reverberating across the room. The atmosphere was one of hope and renewal, a promise that Cedar Ridge would forever protect the freedoms of its residents. Within the reformed HOA board and local public safety departments, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, instituted comprehensive training programs on ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established to ensure that every complaint was rigorously evaluated and that no resident would ever again suffer from arbitrary fines. "Our duty is to safeguard the rights of every member of our community," Lieutenant Reed declared in a follow-up press conference, reinforcing our united commitment to fairness and integrity. Community leaders and civil rights organizations further galvanized the movement by organizing workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns centered on property rights and individual freedom. When we unite, our voices become an unstoppable force for change, a local activist passionately remarked at a town hall meeting, inspiring many to embrace the fight for a more equitable community. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. My decision to stand my ground, refusing to let the HOA officers trample on my long-held property rights, had not only reinstated my freedom, but had also sparked a broader movement for justice in Cedar Ridge. Neighbors, emboldened by our shared victory, began to share their own stories of resistance. My digital dossier, which captured every moment of the invasion and every ounce of our collective defiance, became a rallying cry that underscored our communal commitment to fairness. Karen Miller, once hailed as the unchallenged enforcer of arbitrary rules, was gradually reduced to a cautionary tale, a reminder that no one is above accountability when a community unites for justice. Her past transgressions, once shielded by her rigid persona, were exposed and widely circulated, highlighting the dangers of unchecked authority. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Cedar Ridge, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered under the warm, golden glow of the setting sun. A large banner reading "Unity, Freedom, and Property Rights" was unfurled between towering oaks, and heartfelt speeches echoed promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate not just our victory over arbitrary enforcement, but the rebirth of our community's spirit, Councilwoman Rivera proclaimed, her voice resolute and inspiring. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to protect our freedoms. As each new day dawned over Cedar Ridge, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how HOA officers invaded my lake house, and how I stood my ground defending a piece of land that had been in my family longer than the HOA ever existed, became a rallying cry for every resident who believed that true authority rests in the hands of the people, not in the whims of an overzealous enforcer. Every sunrise now carried with it the promise that in Cedar Ridge, truth, justice, and individual freedom would forever prevail. In the end, What began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined than ever to safeguard our rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Cedar Ridge would forever be a place where creativity, integrity, and respect for individual expression shone as brightly as the morning light on a peaceful lake.